All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to start getting into our How to DBQ for 2020. Hello, everyone. Today we get to start our lesson on how to write the essay for your AP exam, the DBQ. DBQ stands for document-based question, but that's not really the best name for it. It is not really document-based, but instead it's just a normal essay where you are provided documents that you can use for evidence to prove your arguments. Just like any other essay, you will still have to make your own argument. It's just that now you have provided information to you that you can use to prove your arguments. You can achieve all the points in something like 4 or 5 paragraphs. You get a total of 45 minutes to write your essay, and you get an additional 5 minutes to upload it. Because you have information provided to you, when you use these documents to prove your arguments, you must cite the source. And you do that just by putting a bracket or a parenthesis and the number of the document after paraphrasing that document. The DBQ this year is going to be worth a total of 10 possible points. 1 point for context, 1 point for thesis, 1 point for using the content from at least 2 documents to address the topic of the prompt, another point for actually making an argument that uses evidence from at least 2 documents to prove your thesis, and of course, supporting an argument using evidence from at least 4 documents out of the 5 is going to be your next evidence piece. There's 2 more points for using outside historical evidence that's not given in the documents to support an argument in response to the prompt. Then you get a possible 2 points for analysis of the documents that explains how or why the author of the document's point of view, purpose, historical situation, or intended audience is relevant to your argument. And then there's the last point, the reasoning or complexity point, that demonstrates a complex understanding of the historical process that is the focus of the prompt. Your DBQ should be written in the third person authoritatively, as if you are the historian, that you know the subject, and that you are relating the events that occurred, as opposed to the I first person or the you second person. So let's take a look at the 2004 AP World History DBQ to get an idea of what this might look like. So here is the 2004 AP World Free Response Question, the DBQ. The prompt is, based on the following documents, analyze the responses to the spread of Buddhism in China. So in this one, they gave us historical background. Buddhism, founded in India in the 6th century before the Common Era, so BCE, that's just a more secular way of saying BC, was brought to China by the 1st century CE, so CE is just a more secular way of saying AD. Gradually winning converts following the collapse of the Han Dynasty in 220 CE. Buddhist influence continued to expand for several centuries. Between 220 and 570, China experienced a period of political instability and disunity. After 570, the imperial structure was restored. All right, so here we go. Document 1. Source. According to Buddhist tradition, the Four Noble Truths, the first sermon preached by the Buddha, 563 BCE to 483 BCE, India, 5th century BCE. The first noble truth is the noble truth of sorrow. Birth is sorrow, age is sorrow, disease is sorrow, death is sorrow. Contact with the unpleasant is sorrow, separation from the pleasant is sorrow, every wish unfulfilled is sorrow. The second noble truth is the noble truth of the arising of sorrow. It arises from craving, which leads to rebirth, which brings delight and passion and seeks pleasure, the craving for sensual pleasure, the craving for continued life, and the craving for power. The third noble truth is the noble truth of the stopping of sorrow. It is the complete stopping of that craving so that no passion remains, leaving it, being emancipated from it, being released from it, giving no place to it. The fourth noble truth is the noble truth of the way that leads to the stopping of sorrow. So there you go. That's document 1. That is the document that sort of begins Buddhism. Document number 2. The source is Ji Dun, a Chinese scholar, author, and confidant of Chinese aristocrats and high officials during the period when northern China was invaded by Central Asian steppe nomads circa 350 of the Common Era. Whosoever in China in this era of sensual pleasures serves the Buddha and correctly observes the commandments, who recites the Buddhist scriptures, and who furthermore makes a vow to be reborn without ever abandoning his sincere intention, will, at the end of his life, when his soul passes away, be miraculously transported thither. He will behold the Buddha and be enlightened in his spirit, and then he will enter nirvana. And it gives us a helping hint. Nirvana is the extinction of desire and individual consciousness. Document 3 is from anonymous Chinese scholar, The Disposition of Error, China circa 500 of the Common Era. Question: if Buddhism is the greatest and most venerable of ways, why did the great sages of the past and Confucius not practice it? In the Confucian classics, no one mentions it. Why then do you love the way of the Buddha and rejoice in outlandish arts? Can the writings of the Buddha exceed the classics and commentaries and beautify the accomplishments of the sages? Answer: all written works need not necessarily be the words of Confucius. To compare the sages to Buddha would be like comparing a white deer to a unicorn or a swallow to a phoenix. The records and teachings of the Confucian classics do not contain everything. Even if the Buddha is not mentioned in them, what occasion is there for suspicion? Question: now, of happiness, there is none greater than the continuation of one's line. Of unfilial conduct, there is none worse than childlessness. The monks forsake wives and children, reject property and wealth. Some do not marry all their lives. Answer: wives, children, and property are the luxuries of the world, but simple living and inaction are the wonders of the way. The monk practices the way and substitutes that for worldly pleasures. He accumulates goodness and wisdom in exchange for the joys of having a wife and children. Document 4 comes from Han Yu, leading Confucian scholar and official at the Tang Dynasty imperial court, in a work called Memorial on Buddhism in 819 CE. Your servant begs leave to say that Buddhism is no more than a cult of the barbarian peoples spread to China. It did not exist here in ancient times. Now I hear that your majesty has ordered the community of monks to go greet the finger bone of the Buddha, which was a relic brought to China from India, and that your majesty will ascend a tower to watch the procession as this relic is brought into the palace. If these practices are not stopped and this relic of the Buddha is allowed to be carried from one temple to another, there will be those in the crowd who will cut off their arms and mutilate their flesh in offerings to the Buddha. Now, the Buddha was a man of the barbarians who did not speak Chinese and who wore clothes of a different fashion. The Buddha's sayings contain nothing about our ancient kings, and the Buddha's manner of dress did not conform to our laws. He understood neither the duties that bind sovereign and subject, nor the affections of father and son. If the Buddha were still alive today and came to our court, your majesty might condescend to receive him, but he would then be escorted to the borders of the nation, dismissed, and not allowed to delude the masses. How then, when he has been long dead, could the Buddha's rotten bones, the foul and unlucky remains of his body, be rightly admitted to the palace? Confucius said, respect ghosts and spirits, but keep them at a distance. Your servant is deeply ashamed and begs that this bone from the Buddha be given to the proper authorities and cast into fire and water, that this evil be rooted out and later generations spared this delusion. Doc 5 is Zheng Mi, a leading Buddhist scholar favored by the Tang imperial household, essay on the nature of man, early 9th century CE. Confucius, Lao Tzu, and the Buddha were perfect sages. They established their teachings according to the demands of the age and the needs of various beings. They differ in their approaches in that they encourage the perfection of good deeds, punish wicked ones, and reward good ones. All three teachings lead to the creation of an orderly society, and for this they must be observed with respect. Doc 6 is the Tang Dynasty Emperor Wu, Edict on Buddhism, 845 Common Era. We have heard that the Buddha was never spoken of before the Han Dynasty. From then on, the religion of idols gradually came to prominence. So, in this latter age, Buddhism has transmitted its strange ways and has spread like a luxuriant vine until it has poisoned the customs of our nation. Buddhism has spread to all the 9 provinces of China. Each day finds its monks and followers growing more numerous and its temples more lofty. Buddhism wears out the people's strength, pilfers its wealth, causes people to abandon their lords and parents for the company of teachers, and severs man and wife with monastic decrees. In destroying law and injuring humankind, indeed, nothing surpasses this doctrine. Now, if even one man fails to work in the field, someone must go hungry. If one woman does not tend her silkworms, someone will go cold. At present, there are an inestimable number of monks and nuns in the empire, all of them waiting for the farmers to feed them and the silkworms to clothe them, while the Buddhist public temples and private chapels have reached boundless numbers, sufficient to outshine the imperial palace itself. Having thoroughly examined all earlier reports and consulted public opinion on all sides, there is no longer remains the slightest doubt in our mind that this evil should be eradicated. All right, so first is the prompt. Once you know the rubric, the next thing to do is to locate the prompt. If you do not really carefully read the prompt, then you will not know how to properly respond in your DBQ. In the case of the 2004 DBQ, most of the student responses scored little to no points because they talked at length about the spread of Buddhism, but did not analyze responses to the spread of Buddhism in China. No, wrong. Let us look at the prompt again. Based on the following documents, analyze the responses to the spread of Buddhism in China. So what is it asking you to do? It's asking you to analyze. Circle the verb or type it out if you're using notes. Underline the object of that verb. You should analyze, which is otherwise known as identifying and explaining responses to the spread of Buddhism in China. So identify what the responses were and give an explanation, otherwise known as a reason. Really, it will probably be a set of 3 reasons for why these responses are that way. Now that you have carefully read the prompt, read through the given historical background. They will usually give you something like a map to refresh your memory. In 2004, the rubrics were different, so they just gave you an example of contextualization. Your DBQ will be different in this way. Once you have read through the background, you know what you're looking for in the documents. You are looking for what the responses were, and you are looking to give a reason for why these responses were that way. Take notes as you go through the documents. Pay close attention to things like point of view of the author and intended audience. Once you have read through the documents, it's time to make groups. This will test your ability to categorize. It helps to think of a bucket and like making a label to put on the bucket, which would be the category, right? Think about putting the documents into the buckets that fit with the given label. I immediately noticed that documents 2, 3, and 5 give reasons for why people like Buddhism. I also noticed that documents 3, 4, and 6 give evidence for why they did not like Buddhism. Yes, you can have one document like 3 that's in multiple groups. Notice Doc 3 is basically just an FAQ, a frequently asked questions, which we notice gives us both common questions about Buddhism and common answers to those questions. Document 1 does not really seem to fit. It is clearly not a response to the spread of Buddhism in China. It is the cause for Buddhism arising in the first place, which is why it had effects like the consequence of the religion spreading into China. The DBQ will test one of 3 given historical thinking skills: causation, change in continuity over time, or comparison. It may not even be obvious at first glance, which skill it is. In this 2004 DBQ, for example, the skill is causation, right? Responses happen because of a cause. So this is how we are going to use document 1 in our DBQ. So the first thing you're going to do is context. Now that you have read the materials in the documents, it's time to start writing your DBQ essay. Begin with context. As I suggested earlier, the DBQ will not usually just give you the context like this one does, but let's use it as a model for perfect contextualization as provided by the College Board. So yours wouldn't look exactly like this, but it would hopefully look something like this. Buddhism, founded in India in the 6th century BCE, was brought to China by the 1st century CE, gradually winning converts following the collapse of the Han Dynasty in 220. Buddhist influence continued to expand for several centuries. Between 220 and 570, China experienced a period of political instability and disunity. After 570, the imperial structure was restored. So, thesis. You want to use as many words from the prompt as you can when responding to the prompt. That way you will ensure that you are on topic, which is the biggest issue, even if it's not clear what the skill is. So an example thesis. Responses to the spread of Buddhism in China differed to a high extent because of the nature of Buddhism, those who preferred the spirituality of the religion, and those who disliked it because it did not reflect Chinese culture. So that thesis would be good enough to score the thesis point. I would expect to see document 1 discussed in the second paragraph, documents 2, 3, and 5 discussed in paragraph 3, and documents 3, 4, and 6 in the final body paragraph. However, this is not ideal. As with the LEQ, if you want to score the reasoning point, you will need to introduce nuance into your DBQ. Show both sides of the skill. So, preferred example, you want to start your thesis out with the word although. Although Buddhism began in India in circa the 6th century BCE, its spread to China in the first millennium CE evoked responses that differed to a high extent because of those who preferred the spirituality of the religion and those who disliked it because it was foreign. So, taking a position in response to the prompt differed to a high extent. Good. That gives you a thesis, right? Because, and then I give reasons after that, which provides a line of reasoning, which is required to score the point. So, topic sentences. You need to make topic sentences at the beginning of your body paragraphs so that you can have something to support with your evidence. Otherwise, you can't get those additional evidence points. This is easy because we just need to restate our arguments from our thesis. Use the language of the question. So, topic sentence for body paragraph number 1 or total paragraph number 2. Buddhism began in India in circa the 6th century BCE, which caused responses when it spread to China. Topic sentence for paragraph number 3. The spread of Buddhism into China evoked responses that differed to a high extent because of those who preferred the spirituality of the religion. Topic sentence for paragraph number 4. The spread of Buddhism into China evoked responses that differed to a high extent because of those who disliked it because it was a foreign religion. In the DBQ, you are provided with documents, and it is expected that you will use information from those documents to prove your arguments. The DBQ is only around 5 paragraphs long, so it is inappropriate to use lengthy quotes from the documents to prove your arguments. In fact, the rubric specifically says don't quote the documents. Do not quote the documents. If the essay were more like 5 pages long, it might be appropriate to use short quotes, like 3 to 5 words at a time. With such a short essay as this, however, even short quotes are inappropriate. Do not quote the documents. You need to paraphrase. Put the information into your own words to prove your arguments. When you do so, you just leave a short note to help the reader know which document you are paraphrasing. Just do it like a quick Chicago note like this here, like that would mean document 1 or 1, or you can do it more like MLA style where you would just put document 1 or whatever. Attempt to use every document provided to prove your thesis, even though you can get away with all but one. There's always the chance that you will misinterpret a document, and you can still get the point if you use all 5. So an example, the Buddha in a sermon defined the nature of life as suffering, and identified what he saw as the cause. His solution, the abandoning of desire, became popular not only in India, but later in China. And there you go. Now I've paraphrased the document. Like the name suggests, outside evidence is information that will prove your argument beyond what is found in the documents. This evidence is assumed to come from your memory, or in 2020, from your notes, and you are allowed to have your notes up and have them open during the exam. And you don't cite your own notes. It's assumed that that's your own information. So try to remember anything that can show that you know more information about this subject. What type of Buddhism became popular in northern China? That's right, Mahayana Buddhism. Was that found in the documents? No, it was not. Usually outside evidence will go at the bottom of your body paragraphs. Try to use as many as you can remember. Again, the DBQ is just a normal essay. If you have more information, say it. There's no getting anything wrong, although, of course, you don't want to just copy and paste from, like, say, your book, because that would be plagiarism. But if you know more information, say it. Put it into your own words. So, example, the type of Buddhism that became popular in northern China was known as Mahayana Buddhism. All right, so analysis. You can score 2 points for this. For at least 2 documents, explain how or why the document's point of view, purpose, historical situation, and or audience is relevant to an argument. To earn these 2 points, the response must explain how or why, rather than simply identifying the document's point of view, purpose, historical situation, or audience is relevant to an argument about the prompt for each of the 3 documents that are sourced. People don't like to write. It's hard. So there are usually a few clear reasons why people do write. Because they're afraid. Oftentimes they're afraid of their emperors killing them, and so they write. Number 2, because they are getting paid. Or 3, because they're trying to get a date. There's a lot of love letters in history, for instance. If you can show how one of these things is present in 2 documents, you can get the analysis points for the DBQ. So, for example, Zhang Mi was afraid to criticize Confucianism because he did not want to offend his Confucian emperor, who relied on the concept of the mandate of heaven to justify his rule over China. The reasoning point is not consistently scored by the readers. It is often referred to as the appreciation point for very excellent essays. However, if you address both sides of the scale, you should be awarded this point. So here's a sample student essay with marked comments. Again, I didn't write this context. This was given by the College Board, but let's assume that this is a good model to follow. That would be 1 point for context. Context should go at the beginning of your essay and should be about 3 sentences or so. Thesis. Although Buddhism began in India in the 6th century BCE, it spread to China in the first millennium, evoked responses that differed to a high extent because of those who preferred the spirituality of the religion and those who disliked it because it was foreign. So at this point, you would get a point for thesis. Buddhism began in India in the 6th century BCE, which caused responses when it spread to China. The Buddha, in a sermon, defined the nature of life as suffering and identified what he saw as the cause. His solution, the abandoning of desire, became popular not only in India, but then later on in China. And so you notice at this point, I've paraphrased the document. I should put a citation so that the reader knows what document that came from. And then I'm going to do analysis. The Buddha's historical situation is relevant because he's preaching in the context of a Hindu society, which would be a major issue as the religion spread to China. So his historical situation is relevant because. So that's a point for document analysis. The type of Buddhism that became popular in northern China was Mahayana Buddhism, or Great Vehicle Buddhism, which gives me a point for outside evidence. Next, the spread of Buddhism into China evoked responses that differed to a high extent because of those who preferred the spirituality of the religion. Ji Dun, for example, clearly was attracted to the notion of nirvana in Buddhism. So now I've paraphrased Doc 2, and now I get a point because I've used 2 documents. His historical context is clearly relevant because he's living in China in a period of disunity before the Sui dynasty reunified China. Without a unifying force, Confucianism likely was not as attractive to those who sought after the spirituality that Buddhism could offer. So that's analysis from 2 documents. An anonymous scholar also shows that there were those who were attracted to the spirituality of Buddhism. He notes the emphasis on spirituality instead of worldly matters in response to frequent questions. So, citation for paraphrasing Doc 3. Like G. Dunn, this scholar's historical context is influenced by the lack of unification that would later come in China under the Sui, Tang, and Sung. Another example is Zhang Mi, who advocated for the good teachings of Buddhism. So at this point, that's 2 more points because I've made an argument. I've supported the argument with information from 4 documents. Finally, the spread of Buddhism into China evoked responses that differed to a high extent because of those who disliked it because it was foreign. So note we've got reasoning because I use both cause and effect, both sides of the skill. The disposition of error shows that there was a consistent set of criticisms to Buddhism. For example, people asked questions that were common enough for the anonymous scholar to make an FAQ. Many Chinese people criticized the monks who would abandon their families. Another example is Han Yu, who continually referred to Buddhism as a cult and of barbarian origin. And Tang Emperor Wu also disliked Buddhism. He did not like that it was taking people away from work and thought that it would cause poverty. Another example of a Confucian scholar who disliked Buddhism was Li Ao, which is another piece of outside evidence. In conclusion, the rise of Buddhism in India around the 6th century CE caused a great number of responses when it spread to China in the first millennium CE. Those responses differed to a high extent because of those who liked the spirituality of the religion and those who disliked it because it was foreign. Wayne Watts, first time I wrote this was 11/8/2019, updated 5/1/2020. All right, ladies and gentlemen, you'll note that you don't use the word document inside your DBQ anywhere except for like citation. You know what I mean? Like Doc 1 or whatever, right? Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, this is a 10-point model DBQ. This is what you need to try to do for your DBQ that's due this upcoming Friday, and this is how you should try to do your DBQ for your AP exam. Keep in mind that your DBQ for your AP exam is 100% of your AP exam score. Ladies and gentlemen, good luck.